Hey kids, it's me. I'm back. I'm here today with my friend, Bob Ross. We're just kind of chilling here, and we want to make a video about global air masses. Now, global air masses are actually kind of easy, and we're going to teach this using math problems because we're just going to add a couple of things together, and we're going to see how all of this works out. And we're going to learn everything on this slide right here before we move on to anything else. So we're going to look at it like this. The first thing I need you to understand is the word continental. And you can see that I already have that highlighted up here. Continental is one of the very first words that we need to learn, and it's very important. If you were to look up the Latin meaning of it, the etymology of it, it means relating to the nature of a continent, which then makes me think of the 7 continents: Africa, Antarctica, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and South America. And all of that's important. You don't have to memorize any of that. However, when I'm thinking of the word continent, I want you to think of this. A continent is over land. Okay, a continent is over land. And that's a very, very important thing to understand. Now, when I'm thinking of over land, like general land, and we think of the water cycle, what are the odds of there being evaporation over land? Well, there's not going to be a lot. You need water to have evaporation. So anytime you have air over the land, we're going to describe that air as very dry. So any of the continental air masses that we have, we already know that they are going to be dry air masses. And that's extremely important. And we'll add that with some other stuff here in a little bit. There's the word maritime. Maritime takes me back to when we were doing ecosystems, and we have that word marine. And we know that the marine, to us, marine meant the oceans, but there's more than just oceans. So we can't label it as oceans, but anything that is maritime is going to have to do with water. Now, again, just like the last continental, if we were going to think in terms of the water cycle, what would an air mass above water be like, or what would it have the ability to be like? A lot of evaporation could occur, so it would not be dry. We would label this one as humid or moist. There's going to be moisture in the air above water. In a maritime air mass, you're going to have moisture. Now, there are 3 words that we need to learn that we are going to add to either continental or maritime. And we'll do that at the end of this, and we're going to see how those would work out. The first word is polar. And I don't think this one's a big shock to anybody. We've talked about the polar plunge. We even watched people in a video doing the polar plunge. I would do the polar plunge because the polar plunge is when you jump into what kind of water? Exactly. Cold water. Cold water. So if you have a polar air mass, the air is going to be cold. Not a shock there. I don't think there's anything tricky about polar air masses. Can it get worse? Absolutely. You could have an Arctic air mass. I will do the polar plunge. I will not do the Arctic plunge because there's a huge difference. In a polar plunge, it is cold. This is described as bitterly cold. And I want to take you back a little bit. It's been a few years, but we had an Arctic blast, and we'll talk about why that came to North Carolina later on when we get to jet streams. But we had an Arctic blast come into North Carolina, and the air temperatures got so cold, we had to delay school in the mornings, not because of sleet, not because of snow. The roads were perfect. The buses were so cold, they would not start. That is bitterly cold. Okay, I'm not jumping in bitterly cold water. That's not happening. It would be frozen. Okay, that would be too much for me, and we're not dealing with it. So I have polar, cold water, Arctic, bitterly cold water, and then tropic. Now, tropic takes us back to when we were talking in the ecosystems, and we talked about things that were tropical, not spelled like that. Or that. Oh, my goodness. There we go. Finally. Tropical. And when we think of tropical, what do we think of? It's either warm, Mr. Bones cannot spell today, or hot. Warm or hot. So we have warm, hot air masses for tropic. I have bitterly cold air masses when they're Arctic. I have cold air masses when they're polar. And the two big ones that we're going to add those two words to are maritime, which means over water. It means the water, that air mass is going to be full of water. It's going to be humid or moist. Or I might have continental, which means it's over land, and that air mass is going to be dry. So let's try some of this addition that we're going to do here. Okay, so we're going to pretend, let's just say, what do you think if you had continental polar air mass? What would it be like? Well, all you have to do is think about, what do those two things mean? Well, continental means dry, polar means cold. I would have cold, dry air in a continental polar air mass. That's not hard, is it? It really is that simple, I promise, for all of them. So let's keep moving these around. Let's keep seeing if we can figure out what these mean. Then we'll go to the actual slides in Nearpod, and we'll talk about them all. Okay. What if I said you had a maritime tropical? Okay. You just have to think about what each of those words mean. Well, I know that in the maritime tropical, it's going to have a lot of moisture in it, and it's going to be warm and hot. Probably going to have some storms going on in that, right? These are not difficult at all to sit here and do these little minor, like, addition problems that I'm calling them, because that's really kind of what it is. You're just adding two things together, and then you're adding what you know about those two things to see if that makes sense. So let's pop over to the Nearpod, and then we'll go through those slides and see if it all makes sense at the end. So we're back at where we started. I just want you to kind of take a look at this. Look, continental Arctic. Bitterly cold, dry air. Is that a shock? Not if you remember what continental means and you remember what Arctic means. What about maritime polar? Well, maritime means it's going to have moisture in it. Polar means it's cold, cool, moist air mass. It really is that simple, I promise. If you could just remember all of the ones that we talked about and then just add them together, and then you'll be good to go. Again, the first really important part of this is to distinguish between continental and maritime. As I said, continental means over land. Okay? We talked about the continents. That's what continental means. Maritime means over water. Again, I'm referring back to ecosystems, marines, mid-oceans. It's not much different here. It's connected to water and the seas and the oceans for sure, because that covers a lot of the earth, right? Now we're going to talk about the three key words, and we've already done this. Polar means cold. Duh, right? We knew that from ecosystems. Tropic means hot. You knew that from ecosystems. Arctic means bitterly cold. Again, I said here in the notes, think Antarctica, right? Yet another thing that we know from ecosystems. Let's tie all this together. Continental polar. Continental polar. I'm thinking in my head, I'm not even looking at the notes. Land, dry, cold, cold, dry air mass, right? And then I look, continental polar, a cool, dry air mass. Wintertime cold, should say, can extend to southern U.S. and even Florida, causing crop damage. Okay, this is continental polar, cold, dry air masses. Okay, these would sink in from, let's say, Canada and maybe a little bit above, because it's not bitterly cold yet, right? And you can see it's coming from the land. Okay, not the maritime polar. We'll get to that later. Continental polar. Okay, coming up from the north of us. Not a shock, right? Continental polar. And it does abbreviate little c, big P. I don't know why they do that. If I can figure out why, I'll let you know. Continental tropic. I'm thinking in my head, not even looking at the notes. Continental means it's over land. Tropic means it's hot. That means this is a hot, dry air mass. And here we go. It's a warm, dry air mass. Continental tropic air does influence the U.S., but mostly in the summertime, because warm, dry air does come up from down south. We can have some other air come from down south, and typically that's going to be our maritime tropical, but then that has moisture in it, and that's some of the ways that we get those big snows if we have a snow in the winter, or we get a lot of heavy rains with the maritime tropic in the summers. But this is continental tropic. This is a warm, dry air. If you see this, if it becomes stagnant, which means if it stays in the Midwest, you can have drought. Drought is that word we talked about earlier in the year that a lot of us struggle with. Don't forget, drought means there's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of rain going on, which makes sense if we think about it from a warm, dry air mass. It's not raining. Okay, you can look at this. Deaths associated with the 1995 heat wave in the Midwest were the result of Continental Tropic and Maritime Tropic air, which stagnated over the central and eastern part of the U.S. And we can get into that later on. Maritime Polar. Now I've moved from continental to maritime. So now I know that this air is full of moisture. And it's polar, so it's cool. And here it is, a cool, moist air mass. Okay? This is what I got to see when I was in Oregon, okay, in the Pacific Northwest, when you have that constant cool rain always coming in like Seattle. That's because of the maritime polar air masses that are near there. It rains a lot, and it's actually kind of cold there. Maritime Tropic. Okay, this is a warm, moist air mass. It's warm. It has a lot of moisture in it. It's very humid. These can be slow moving, as you see here, and can get a lot of moisture to draw up and produce pretty high levels of precipitation. It can also have low levels of precipitation. That just depends on where it moves, how fast it moves, and how much condensation, cloud formation there is before we have precipitation. Continental Arctic, I talked about that bitterly cold, dry air mass. We've had that sink down before, and that's when we have those school closures, at least in the mornings, until the buses could actually get warm enough to start. And again, that's little c, big A, Continental Arctic, bitterly cold and dry air mass. And we will stop right there. Hopefully you learned a little bit about air masses. I think the big thing that I hope you learned is how easy it is to differentiate between the ones that we have. Because all you have to do is add either continental or maritime and what you know about that, and then you add the words after it, whether it's Arctic, whether it's polar, whether it's tropical, and you put those together in that little teeny tiny of a math sentence, and you're good to go. If you have any questions, make sure you leave those on the Google Classroom. Please keep the comments on Google Classroom down to just questions about science, because it's really hard for me and Miss Klein and Miss Scotty to navigate all of those comments, and I feel like we might miss someone's very important question with silly talk back and forth. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon.